Welcome to a beginner Docker tutorial. We'll also cover the basics of AWS App Runner. To start with a secure image, we're going to use a chain guard image. And we'll use Flask to deploy a simple website. We'll create a new directory for our basic Flask application called AWS Chain Guard Runner, because we're going to deploy it to App Runner. Flask is a basic Python server-side framework, so we're going to need Python. We'll use Python 3, and we're going to use something called venv, so the virtual environment for Python. And this venv will be needed by Docker. So on Ubuntu, I have to install it as a separate package here. And in general, if you're doing Python development, you're using some type of virtual environment. venv, I think nowadays it's the most popular one. So after we install the module, we're going to have to activate it with source venv bin activate. And if you're on Windows, the command's slightly different. But I think if you just Google on venv, you can find the command for Windows. So Flask does install a bunch of other Python dependencies, but Flask is pretty minimal compared to Django, the other very popular server-side framework. We're going to freeze the requirements into requirements.txt by convention. This is generally standard. And also Docker will use the requirements.txt. We're not using Git in this tutorial, so if you're starting it up to GitHub, you might want to add a .gitignore. You can just search online for that. We'll just focus on the basics here, and so we'll create a main.py file. In VS Code, I'll install the Python extensions, and you'll probably have this already installed if you have done any Python development before. We'll first install the Flask module for Python. And again, Flask is just a bare bones, kind of like a web server, application server for Python. If you put this in production, you probably want to put Nginx, but we're just going to use the basic Flask development web server that's built into Flask for this tutorial. We're also putting everything into the same main.py file. The routes will be the kind of like the pages or the links that you want your application to go to. We'll just have a single page here. So it's the default route, which is the slash. Right now, we're just going to return a string, which is HTML, and it'll say hello world. And I have a typo in here. It should be app.route. And for this one, I think we'll just have one page, so we'll just have a single route, right? So if you had more than one page, like a link, you could just set up a secondary route and slash whatever the name of the route is. But for a single route, we'll just have this one single route, and we'll just run the main method run here by default. If you're not familiar with Python, that if kind of weird syntax, if name equals main, that just tells it which of the methods to run by default. There's only one method here. So let's run it. We'll just do Python main.py, and the Flask server starts up automatically. Pay attention that this is a development server, and you probably want to put something Nginx or something as the main web server when you actually go to deployment. But this will be fine for the tutorial. So we have everything working from a standalone Python application, right, where you're just running Python main.py and the Flask server starts out. So let's dig into the Docker file. And I'm also going to install the Docker extension into VS Code. So the Docker file has a special syntax. And we're going to use the chain guard image. We're actually going to use two different chain guard images. And this kind of tells you the strength of this approach here, because the first ChainGuard image has more tools in it for development, but that's not the one that we're going to use for deployment. So the latest hyphen dev is the version that has the development tools that is needed to deploy the Python application. On line 2 there should be a slash in front of D-Days. So D-Days is kind of this mock-up website that we're building called Docker Days. This is just to test some of the concepts with ChainGuard images. So right now we're copying the environment, the Python environment, as well as the requirements.txt into this development image of Docker. This isn't actually the image that we're going to deploy. We're going to get all the dependencies, but we're not going to cache it. So this pip install will install the packages, but there's not going to be a cache of the packages on our system. So for the production, we're going to use this different image, which is Python latest. So it's a smaller image with just Python in it. There's no shell. And before you get too worried, oh, what do you mean there's no shell? Well, when you're doing your Python development, you'll do it on your local computer, which does have a shell. So it doesn't really affect your development process. This is pretty cool for the deploy that it runs this 2 stages with the development image, and then for the production image, it's this super slim, more secure Docker image. So it's quite cool. Once you set up this file, you can enjoy all the benefits of this workflow, this secure workflow. And it doesn't, once it's set up, it doesn't really impact your development workflow. You can develop however you want to. However, there's some configuration up front. After it's configured, the workflow is actually quite easy. On line 19, the templates, make sure that it's in this other subfolder, templates, right? So it's templates./templates. We don't have a templates folder yet because we just outputted a string, returned it from the Flask method. However, we're going to have a small HTML file in the future, and we'll put that into the templates subdirectory of our project. It's quite an elegant solution for security to just have Python in the image. You can of course install other things here. And for the next part, you will need to have Docker installed. You can probably go online for your operating system and figure out how to install Docker. In this case, I do have Docker installed, so I can run the command Docker. So Docker build, we're going to build it, dd days, and the current directory, dot, and we'll create our Docker build here. So the Docker run command has --rm, which is going to remove the the file system from the container after the container exits. The -IT is interactive terminal or virtual terminal. And the -P is the port. And I got this error about no module Flask, but the actual root of the problem is I simply forgot on line 2 to put the vNVM in the path, right? So the Flask module is there. It's just it's not in the path. So once you add it to the path, let's rebuild it and try it again here. Now it looks like it's working from the Docker image. All right, let's get this Docker container up on AWS. We're first going to do 2 steps. I mean, you have to log in first, of course, and then we're going to create the container registry with the image that we just created locally. So we're going to push this first, the container in the registry. We're going to use a public registry for this tutorial, so you don't have to mess with the security. To actually find ECR, you might have to search on Amazon. I have it bookmarked here at the top on my console, but if you can't find it, you can just type it into the search bar of the AWS console. And this is not going to be a permanent registration, so I'll just call it something that is meaningful for this, only for this tutorial. And we have a mock-up site called Docker Days. So we first create the repository, and it's empty, and then we'll put the image up there. So press on the orange button, create repo. And now we got it, but there's nothing in it right now. So we're going to have to push the image up. And there's a helpful button in the upper right that will give you the commands needed to push it. You're going to need to have the AWS CLI, the command line interface. You have to install it on your whatever platform you're using, so Linux, Mac, or Windows. And to be honest, this is a little difficult to actually get running for the first time for me. At least it was on Mac and Windows. On Linux, it's pretty straightforward. So if you don't have AWS CLI installed, you might want to review the documentation. I can also do another video walkthrough if there's interest, but I'm assuming there's plenty of tutorials on using the AWS CLI since it's so common and so popular. Just to be candid, so people don't feel that, oh man, they're stuck trying to install the AWS CLI on Windows and getting it to work. But it did take me a fair bit of time when I did it on Windows and Mac. I'm showing it on Linux, Ubuntu 22.04, because it seems to just work fine without any special configuration. I did need to generate a key, of course, but I think the CLI, it gives you step-by-step information on how to do that. And after the first configuration, it's very easy to use, right? So you just go through the steps. Just copy and paste it in. And it'll push up the image up to the repository. In an actual workflow, you'd automate this. However, there's only a few steps here, so it's pretty easy to go through it manually. Once you have the container in the registry here, we can then use App Runner. So you might have to search on the Amazon, that search bar at the top for App Runner. Again, I kind of bookmarked it here. You can just click on, I think it's a star, and then it appears on your front page in that top bar there. So let's go to the App Runner section. This is the thing that's actually going to run the container, and it's a bit easier to configure than some other Amazon services, in my opinion. I'm going to set up to the lowest possible resources because this is just a tutorial. And if you do set it for higher resources, you may increase your costs. So, if you're just doing it for practice, you probably want to delete the App Runner service afterwards. This does provide a pretty nice entry point for automatic scaling. You can, of course, set it to a higher CPU in the future. We'll set the port to 4000. We'll set the auto scaling here just to keep it so it doesn't get out of control, and maybe get some practice with the auto scaling configuration. So there's only 3 properties here. The site's pretty lightweight, so you could probably have it higher than 5 instances. Configuration is pretty simple. Let's go next. We have our scalable resources here. And let's create and deploy it. I ran into a minor problem because I think I copied in the wrong container. So I had to go back and get the correct URI for the container that I was using. Maybe it was just stuck in my clipboard or something. Okay, so then it's going to be updating for a couple minutes. And you can check the logs, make sure everything's going nicely. And eventually it's green, which means that it finished successfully. You now have a live website. Congratulations. It's pretty bare bones, a real hello world. You can, of course, assign a custom domain to this. For the tutorial, we'll just use the default public domain that's supplied. And even with this rudimentary workflow, it's actually not too bad to update it. So we'll just show you in the templates folder, we'll create a file, home.html, and we'll put a pre-built template in here that I'm getting from Mamba UI, which uses Tailwind. Tailwind, you either like it or you don't like it because it's pretty clear what it does, but it doesn't, it kind of goes against the whole thing of separating the styles. Anyway, you can use whatever template you want. We're using Mamba UI, which is based on Tailwind. And on line 1, remember we have this render underscore template that we are including in the import statement. And we'll have the home.html file. Reload the page and boom. So this is the template that we just downloaded. All the images are actually coming over the network for this one. We're not using local storage. We just have the template that is stored within the templates folder. And also remember that even though it's starting to look like a normal website, it's still using the development server, not the production server. So you have to re-architect it if you actually want it to go for full deployment. The focus on this is just how to get started with AWS App Runner and Docker. So we'll just push it up again here, follow the steps. Pretty straightforward. And we'll just press the deploy button again, and it kind of churns for a while. And eventually it deploys the updated website. Pretty cool. So using this workflow, you can get started with a much more secure way to deploy your containers. And once it's set up, the development workflow is pretty straightforward too. Thanks for joining us in our Docker days.